At 10:30 a.m. on October 30, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Hershel Smith stood on the warped, bomb-scarred flight deck of the USS Enterprise at Noumea, New Caledonia. Around him, CBS construction battalion sailors in coveralls worked in clouds of sparks, welding steel plates over craters so deep a man could stand inside them. The smell of burned paint and hot metal hung in the air. It had been only 4 days since those bomb holes had been blasted open at the Battle of Santa Cruz, a fight that nearly ended the ship's life. Yet, here she was again, defying logic, defying death. Enterprise EV-6, 25,000 tons of steel, 824 feet long, was already a legend. No other American warship would ever earn more decorations. But at this moment, she was a cripple afloat, held together by courage, luck, and Smith's relentless will. A ship alone, the battle had left 44 men dead, 75 more wounded. The forward elevator jammed like a broken tooth. A torpedo near miss had buckled her hull. Fuel still leaked from cracked tanks. One entire section of the ship bulged grotesquely to starboard. By every rule of naval procedure, she belonged in a dry dock for months of overhaul. The problem was simple and terrible. There was nowhere else to turn. Lexington was at the bottom of the Coral Sea. Yorktown had gone down at Midway. Wasp was lost to torpedoes in September. Hornet had just been sunk at Santa Cruz, Saratoga. Lay wounded in Pearl Harbor's repair basin. That left Enterprise, the last operational American carrier in the Pacific, alone between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the islands of the Solomons. The Japanese knew it too. 3 separate times that year, their intelligence bureaus had declared Enterprise destroyed after Eastern Solomons, after Santa Cruz, after every fight where she disappeared into smoke. Yet each time, the same grey silhouette returned to battle. The enemy had started calling her the Grey Ghost, the ship that refused to die, the man who wouldn't quit. Hershel Smith, Michigan-born Naval Academy class of 1922, was not a man who flinched easily. Officially, he was the carrier's damage control officer, the man responsible for keeping her alive once the shooting started. Unofficially, he was her guardian spirit. Smith had trained as a line officer, qualified to command, but his gift was understanding ships as living machines, how frames bent under blast, where bulkheads gave way, how fire and flooding spread through steel corridors. He could visualize a schematic of the Enterprise in his head. Every pump, every power conduit, every watertight door. He'd walked every compartment, crawled through void spaces, memorized where each cable ran. He trained his teams until reaction replaced thought-fire drills, flooding drills, bomb-hit drills, darkness, storm, or calm. The drills never stopped. When the alarm rings, he told them, "You won't think you'll move." That doctrine saved the carrier more than once. Eastern Solomons, baptism by fire in August 1942. During the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Smith stood on the bridge when a Japanese bomb tore through the flight deck. He felt the deck shudder, saw fire blossom skyward, and ran toward the flames before reports even reached the captain. Below, his men were already fighting, hoses spraying foam, stretcher parties carrying the burned, sailors hurling fragments of smoking debris overboard. Smith assessed the situation in seconds. A bomb had punched through 3 decks. Fires were spreading aft. Power was out on half the ship. His orders came crisp and quick. Contain the fire there. Shore up that bulkhead. Route power through these circuits. Pump these compartments dry. They obeyed without hesitation. The fires were contained. The ship survived. Santa Cruz. When the sky fell to months later, came the Battle of Santa Cruz, a contest that nearly erased her from history. Between 10 o'clock and 10:05 a.m. on October 26th, 2 direct bomb hits and 2 near misses slammed into Enterprise. Smith was below decks when the first one landed. The blast threw him down, cut the lights, and filled the corridor with smoke. Emergency lanterns flickered to life seconds later. He pulled himself up, shaking, ears ringing, and sprinted toward the sound of destruction. The second bomb struck before he got there, a blow so violent it threw him against a bulkhead. Still he moved. What he found was nightmare made. Real passageways choked with smoke. Men screaming, some aflame, others pinned under wreckage. Electrical cables sparked from the ceiling. Fire mains ruptured, spraying seawater into the darkness. Smith's voice cut through the chaos like a siren. Get these men clear. Kill that power. Close those hatches. Start the pumps. They obeyed because they trusted him. He never gave an impossible order. By logic, the carrier should have gone down that day. Bombs had pierced to interior spaces. Flooding spread through multiple compartments. Fires licked at the edges of magazines. But Smith's network of repair parties acted like a nervous system, sealing and cooling faster than disaster could spread. Enterprise lived. The 4 days at New Mefta, the battered carrier limped south to New. The task of resurrection fell to Smith and a detachment of 75 CBS construction specialists borrowed from a nearby unit. They weren't trained for shipboard damage control, but they were welders, carpenters, and mechanics of the highest caliber. Smith directed. They improvised. They worked for days and nights without pause. Welding arcs flickered across the deck as men patched bomb holes with scavenged steel. Carpenters shaped wooden plugs to fit jagged deck ruptures. Mechanics jury-rigged the frozen elevator with cables and pulleys. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't by the book, but it worked. When Enterprise sailed again on November 11th, the repairs were unfinished. Smith knew exactly how fragile she was. The bow plating could split under another hit. The elevator structure might collapse if jarred. The buckled hull could flood beyond control. Still, she would sail, because the war would not wait. A ship is never perfect, Smith told his men. What matters is that she fights. Orders from desperation, while welders still hammered on her deck. Word arrived. Japanese battleships were moving toward Guadalcanal to bombard Henderson Field, the airstrip that kept the island in American hands. If Henderson fell, the entire campaign could collapse. Enterprise had to sail now, no matter her wounds. Captain Osborne Hardison, newly in command for barely 10 days, read the orders in silence. He was 49, deliberate, and steady, the kind of officer whose calm could anchor a storm. He turned to Smith. "Can she fight?" he asked. Smith told the truth. The forward elevator was crippled. Leaks remained. The watertight integrity was shaky. "If we take a hit in the wrong spot," he said, "she'll go down fast." Then he added the one sentence Hardison needed. "But her engines run, her steering's true, and her catapults work. She can fight." That was enough. Hardison gave the order. Enterprise sails at dawn. At 600 hours, on November 11, 1942, Enterprise steamed out of Noumea Harbor with welders still at work, hammers echoing over the Pacific swells. The ship vibrated from the rhythmic pound of air tools. Patches of fresh steel gleamed dull gray against the scorched flight deck. Fuel oil still seeped in streaks down her hull, but her flag flew high. The gray ghost was going to war again. Fighting half-built flight deck crew could still smell wet paint as the air group prepared for takeoff. Fighting 10, the Grim Reapers, was only half its original strength. Bombing 10 and Torpedo 10 were patched together with borrowed aircraft and pilots who hadn't slept properly in days. Yet, when the catapults clanged and the engines roared, the deck crews cheered as if nothing were wrong. At sea, courage sometimes meant pretending the ship wasn't held together by luck and prayer. On November 20, Enterprise began launching strikes toward the Solomon Islands. Supporting surface forces near Guadalcanal, her squadrons took off into overcast skies, flying through squalls and broken clouds, navigating by compass and dead reckoning. They hunted the enemy fleet in an ocean wider than the continent they'd left behind. At 9 a.m., Enterprise dive bombers found their first target, the heavy cruiser retreating north after bombarding Henderson Field. The Japanese captain thought he was clear. He was wrong. From 12,000 feet, the dauntlesses of Bombing 10 rolled into their dives. Tracers climbed toward them. The ocean flashed white where shells burst. One after another, the bombs struck home, explosions tearing through Kinagasa's decks, igniting fuel and ammunition. By early afternoon, she rolled to port and sank with more than 500 of her crew. The American pilots returned, exhausted but alive. They refueled, rearmed, and waited for the next call. Some were barely 20 years old. None showed fear. That night, while Enterprise's planes slept below deck, the surface fleet fought the night action off Savo Island, a brutal, point-blank duel where USS Atlanta and other ships slugged it out with battleship Haie. The sea flashed with gunfire. Ships passed so close that shells punched through hulls without detonating. When dawn came, a 14-inch gunned monster was crippled, drifting at 8 knots, bleeding oil and smoke. Smith, pacing the damage control center aboard Enterprise, could sense the chance that was coming. When Admiral Halsey's message came through, "Find and finish the crippled battleship," the men on Enterprise knew their turn had come. The kill of battleship High at first light on November 13th, Enterprise launched again. Wildcats for cover, Dauntlesses with 1,000-pound bombs, Avengers with Mark 13 torpedoes. The crews had slept barely 2 hours. At 7:20 a.m. they sighted High, limping north of Savo Island, her hull scarred, her rudder jammed. The American pilots dove. Bombs found their mark, tearing open her decks. Torpedoes followed 2, maybe 3, slamming into her port side. Fires erupted. Water poured in. Then Marine aircraft from Henderson Field arrived, attacking again and again. Even Army B-17s from Espiritu Santo dropped bombs from high altitude. By dusk, High was a dying wreck. At 6:15 p.m., her captain ordered scuttling charges set. The battleship that had shelled Pearl Harbor's wake 3 years earlier slipped beneath the sea, taking more than 800 souls with her. The crew of Enterprise learned the news over the loudspeakers. The mess deck erupted in cheers and then went silent, realizing it was only the beginning. More enemy ships were coming. Still at work through all of it, the Seabees kept welding. Sparks still flew from the deck even as planes launched above them. The elevator patching continued amid the thunder of catapults. Below, Smith's men chased leaks and rewired circuits damaged by shockwaves. Every time a bomb struck near the ship, they checked bulkheads for cracks, listened for the hiss of escaping air, and braced for the next hit that by miracle never came. When Enterprise anchored briefly at Guadalcanal that week, she was stronger than when she'd sailed. The elevator moved again. The whole patches held. Against all precedent, the repairs had continued in combat. It was the first time in naval history that a major warship had been rebuilt, while still fighting a war. What the stakes meant what hung in the balance that November wasn't just a ship, it was the entire Pacific front. Japan's fleet still outnumbered America's in carriers and trained pilots. The next months would decide whether the United States could hold the Solomons, until new Essex-class carriers rolled off the slips in 1943. If Enterprise fell, there would be nothing left to stop Japan from regaining control of the air over Guadalcanal. Every pilot, every Marine, every sailor there depended on the patched-up hulk now plowing north. Through the Coral Sea, the irony was cruel. The world's most powerful nation hung its hopes on a vessel held together by weld, seams and faith. The battle builds on. The morning of November 14th. Reconnaissance spotted a Japanese troop convoy steaming south. 11 transports, carrying 10,000 soldiers, artillery, and tanks, all bound to retake Guadalcanal. Enterprise's air group scrambled again. They had flown nearly non-stop for 3 days, yet they climbed back into their cockpits without complaint. The dauntless bombers attacked first, diving from 12,000 feet in steep 70-degree plunges. The transports had almost no defense. One after another, bombs smashed into their holds, detonating ammunition and fuel. Ships broke apart, rolled, vanished. Flames painted the sea orange. Marine planes joined in, followed by Army B-17s dropping from high altitude. The slaughter lasted hours. By mid-afternoon, 7 of the 11 transports had sunk. The remaining 4 were burning wrecks, crawling toward shore. When night fell, those 4 drove themselves onto the beaches at Tassafaronga, unloading what few survivors remained. Barely 2,000 soldiers reached land armed. The rest were lost with their equipment beneath the sea. Smith watched from the flight deck catwalk as the horizon glowed with burning ships. For once, there was nothing to repair, only the quiet, eerie satisfaction of victory. Enterprise endures. On November 15th, the last major surface battle of the Guadalcanal campaign unfolded. Battleships Washington and South Dakota met Japan's Kirishima in a duel of giants. By dawn, Kirishima lay wrecked and sinking. In 4 days, the Japanese had lost 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 7 transports, a catastrophic blow that turned the tide of the Pacific War. When Captain Hardison sent his report to the Navy Department on November 16th, he chose his words carefully. The emergency repairs accomplished by this skillful, and energetically devoted force had placed this vessel in condition for further action against the enemy. He was talking about Smith and the Seabees, the anonymous welders, carpenters and repairmen who'd done the impossible under fire. Admiral William Bull Halsey followed with his own dispatch, praising their speed and efficiency and commending their willingness, zeal, and capability. It was rare for combat zone construction crews to be singled out, yet even that recognition only hinted at the truth. because what those men had really done was change the course of the Pacific War. Legacy, forged in fire when Enterprise returned to Noumea on November 16th. She was against every expectation better than when she had sailed 5 days earlier. The patches held, systems worked. A ship that should have been crippled in dry dock had sunk 2 battleships and a cruiser, destroyed a troop convoy, and ensured that the United States would hold Guadalcanal. From that week forward, Enterprise's legend was sealed. The Japanese Navy never again mounted a serious offensive in the Solomons. In February 1943, they began evacuating the remnants of their forces. The battle for Guadalcanal, the turning point of the Pacific, had been won largely because one wounded ship refused to die. For Hershel Smith, it was the proof of everything he believed, that what saved ships in war wasn't design or armor, but the men who refused to quit inside them. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the USS Enterprise should have been tied up at Ford Island. Fate, or perhaps chance, delayed her. A squall line over the Pacific slowed her return from a ferry mission to Wake Island. That storm saved her. The day that changed everything at dawn. Enterprise's air group was already inbound to Oahu's beady Dauntless, scouts returning to Pearl. They broke through the cloud layer to find smoke curling up from Battleship Row. Below them, the harbor burned. Japanese aircraft swarmed like hornets. 7 Enterprise dive bombers were shot down, some by Japanese fighters, some by panicked American gunners who mistook friend for foe. 8 of her airmen died that morning. 2 more were wounded. Their sacrifice marked Enterprise as the first American carrier to lose men in the Pacific War. When the carrier arrived the next day, December 8th, the harbor lay in ruins. Oil still burned on the water. Battleships lay capsized in the mud. Enterprise moored among wreckage but did not rest. She refueled, rearmed, and within 72 hours, was back at sea hunting. On December 10th, her aircraft found and sank the Japanese submarine I-70, the first confirmed warship killed by U.S. forces after the declaration of war. It was a small victory, but it meant something profound. The counterattack had begun. Raider of the Pacific through the first months of 1942, Enterprise became the Navy's sharpest blade. In February, she led strikes against Kwajalein, Waj, and Malolap in the Marshall Islands. 3 ships went down, 8 more were damaged, airfields cratered, fuel dumps exploded. Japanese bombers retaliated furiously, but Enterprise evaded every strike. Not one bomb found her deck. The lesson was clear: speed and air power now ruled the ocean. The age of the battleship was ending, and Enterprise was at the heart of the revolution. In April 1942, she escorted the carrier Hornet on a mission so improbable that it bordered on myth. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers from the U.S. Army Air Forces waited on Hornet's deck, bound for Tokyo itself. Enterprise provided fighter cover and shot up Japanese picket boats that spotted the task force. The Doolittle Raid did little material damage, but it changed psychology on both sides. Tokyo learned its own cities were vulnerable. American morale, shattered since Pearl Harbor, suddenly soared. Japan pulled air defenses back to the home islands, weakening its perimeter. The strategic balance shifted. The gathering storm by May, Japanese admirals had a plan to draw out and annihilate the remaining U.S. carriers. Their target, Midway, a tiny speck of coral 2,000 miles west of Hawaii. The Japanese expected to ambush whatever American carriers came to defend it, crush them with overwhelming force, and secure dominance of the Pacific. What they didn't know was that U.S. Navy codebreakers had already cracked their operational cipher. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew where and when the attack would come. He positioned Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet northeast of Midway, hidden beyond Japanese reconnaissance range. It was an ambush waiting for an ambush. Admiral Raymond Stentz, commanding from Enterprise's flag bridge, understood the stakes. If they lost here, the path to Hawaii lay open. Enterprise was no longer just a ship, she was a hinge of history. Midway, the 5 minutes that changed the world. At 6:30 a.m., June 4, 1942, Japanese carriers launched 108 aircraft toward Midway Atoll. The island's defenders scrambled every plane, Marine fighters, Army bombers, even obsolete biplanes to meet them. Most were shot down. Japanese pilots reported the base in flames. Victory seemed certain. Then, at 7:05 a.m., the American carriers launched everything they could muster. Enterprise's decks roared alive. 33 dive bombers, 14 torpedo planes, 10 fighters clawing into the sky. Yorktown and Hornet followed suit. Over 150 aircraft set out, threading through clouds, searching the empty ocean. Coordination broke down. Navigation errors scattered formations across hundreds of miles. Hornet's air group flew the wrong direction and found nothing. Enterprise's torpedo squadron VT-6, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, pressed on alone. Their Douglas TBD Devastators were outdated, slow, and alarmed, but they attacked without hesitation and without fighter escort. At 9:20 a.m., they sighted the Japanese strike force, Akagi Kaga, Haryufu carriers that had bombed Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Lindsay's men came in at wave-top height, dropping torpedoes amid a hurricane of flak and Zero fighters. 13 of the 15 were shot down. Lindsay's plane disintegrated in fire. Ensign George Gay, floating alone on a seat cushion, watched his comrades and watched the rest of the battle unfold. Moments later, Yorktown's VT-3 attacked. 10 of 12 shot down. Then, Hornet's VT-8, 15 Devastators, 14 destroyed. Not a single torpedo hit its target. The torpedo attacks looked like suicides without purpose. Yet those doomed squadrons had done the impossible. They had dragged Japan's combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the skies above open. The hunters apart at 9:55 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, leading Enterprise's dive bomber squadrons, realized he was lost. The ocean stretched empty to every horizon. Fuel was running low. He could have turned back. Instead, he made a gambler's choice, spotting a solitary Japanese destroyer racing northeast at high speed. McClusky deduced it was hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. He turned to follow. 5 minutes later, the sea below erupted with movement for carriers maneuvering in tight formation, their decks crammed with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered, fuel hoses snaking across the planks. The Japanese were at their most vulnerable. McClusky Sky didn't hesitate. He split his force, half to attack Kaga, half to strike Akagi. The dive began. From 14,000 feet, 33 dauntless bombers fell like stones. The Japanese gunners fired wildly. Tracers streaked upward, but the bombers came straight down at 70 degrees, screaming through their dives. Pilots steadied their sights, released at 1,500 feet, and pulled out under crushing G-forces. 4 bombs hit Kaga. One pierced her hangar deck and detonated among fuel tanks. Another ripped through the island superstructure, killing the bridge crew instantly. Within minutes, Kaga was engulfed in fire, so intense that steel bulkheads glowed red. Akagi, struck by a single bomb from Lieutenant Commander Dick Best, suffered a hit that proved just as fatal. The bomb punched through the flight deck midships, exploded among armed aircraft below, and turned her hangar into an inferno. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air, almost simultaneously. Yorktown's bombers hit Soryo, scoring 3 perfect strikes. The carrier erupted, her crew leaping into the sea. By 10:05 a.m., 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were mortally wounded. The Pacific War turned in those 5 minutes, finishing the 4th only. Hairyu remained. Furious, she launched a counterattack at noon. Her bombers found Yorktown, scoring 2 direct hits and 2 torpedoes that left the ship dead in the water. For a brief moment, it seemed the Japanese might even the score, but Enterprise was already preparing her own reply. At 3:30 p.m., she launched 24 dive bombers under Lieutenant Richard Best. They found Hairyu at 2 p.m., rolling north under a bright setting sun. 4 bombs slammed into her deck, igniting aviation fuel and munitions. By dawn the next day, Hairyu joined her sisters on the ocean floor. In less than 24 hours, Japan's striking arm was annihilated, 4 carriers sunk, hundreds of veteran pilots lost. The same squadrons that had destroyed Pearl Harbor were gone forever. American losses were heavy but bearable. Yorktown and destroyer Hammond torpedoed by a submarine. 307 men killed. Enterprise and Hornet came through virtually unscathed. The message went out across the fleet. Scratch for Platypus. The impossible had happened. The Pacific tide had begun to reverse. Aftermath and revelation when Enterprise's airmen landed back on deck. Many had fuel for less than 5 minutes of flight. They climbed out of their cockpits, trembling, ears ringing, sunburned eyes red from strain. McClusky, whose instinct to follow that lone destroyer had changed the course of the war, walked the deck in silence, unaware he had just joined the immortals of naval history. Midway cost Japan not only ships but something far greater. Her corps of elite naval aviators. The Empire would never again mount a fully trained carrier strike force. For the United States, Midway meant survival and momentum. Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor to resupply. When she entered port, sailors from every ship lined the rails to cheer her. She was no longer just a carrier. She was a symbol. Between victories in the summer of 1942, Enterprise steamed south again, toward the Solomons. By August she was covering the Marine landings on Guadalcanal, the first American offensive of the war. On August 24th, she met the Japanese in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Her planes sank the light carrier Riru, but Enterprise herself took 3 direct bomb hits, and 4 near. 74 sailors died, 95 were wounded. Flames tore through her decks. Her hull plates twisted like paper. Once more, Smith's damage control teams raced into the inferno. They sealed ruptures, pumped out flooded compartments, and kept the ship afloat. She limped back to Pearl Harbor under her own power. 5 weeks later, patched and repainted, the Grey Ghost was back at sea. The Navy had never seen anything like it. Carriers hit that hard were supposed to be out of action for months. Enterprise was proving what the rest of the fleet would learn, only slowly. Damage control, not armor. Wins survival. Santa Cruz. The breaking point. 2 months later came the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. On October 26, 1942, Enterprise and Hornet faced a Japanese fleet with 4 carriers and a screen of battleships. Hornet went down fighting. Enterprise was hammered by bombs and near misses. 44 dead, 75 wounded. Her forward elevator jammed, her hull warped. Once again, she should have gone home to die. Instead, she sailed south into the fight that would save Guadalcanal. That desperate period, when Enterprise alone carried the war in the Pacific, would forge the legend that the Japanese came to believe. She could not be sunk. The Grey Ghost's reputation across the ocean. Japanese intelligence officers grew superstitious. Reports claimed Enterprise had been destroyed at least 3 times. Yet each month she reappeared, launching aircraft, burning but unbroken. Some enemy analysts concluded there must be multiple ships bearing the same name. Others whispered that American repair capabilities bordered on sorcery. The truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Enterprise survived because her people refused to let her die. By the end of 1942, she had fought in 5 of the 6 major carrier battles of the Pacific War. She missed only the Coral Sea, arriving too late to participate. She had taken bomb hits 5 times, lost nearly 200 men, and been proclaimed sunk by Tokyo radio on 3 occasions. Each time she came back, the Grey Ghost was now more than a nickname. It was an identity, a legend sailors whispered as if it were a prayer and a warning all at once. The shape of things to come while American industry prepared a new wave of carriers, the Essex and Independence. Class's Enterprise bore the entire weight of the war's midpoint alone. Every strike she launched, every battle she endured, bought time for those shipyards to finish their work. Every rivet she held together mattered in those early years. Before numbers and logistics tilted the balance, victory was measured in the endurance of a single ship, and in the men like Hershel Smith who refused to yield. Enterprise had already faced storms, bombs, torpedoes, and fire. Ahead lay the long grind, the rebuilding of 1943, the Great Island campaigns, and the ultimate crucible that would carry her from the Solomons to the doorstep of Japan. But for now, in the closing months of 1942, the Pacific belonged to one battered, unkillable carrier, the ship that ghosts were made of. A ship reborn when 1943 dawned, the USS Enterprise lay battered but undefeated. Her hull still bore the welded scars of Santa Cruz. Her flight deck gleamed with patches of new steel. The weld marks were ugly, but they were proud. The men who served aboard her had begun calling those scars battle tattoos, proof that she had been tested and survived. The carrier returned to Pearl Harbor in January for the overhaul she had long been denied. Dockyard cranes lifted twisted armor plates from her sides. Engineers replaced burned wiring, overhauled engines, rebuilt elevators. For the first time in 10 months, the Grey Ghost rested. Even during refit, she was a symbol. Crews from new ships visited to learn from her officers and from the man every sailor on the West Coast now knew by name, Lieutenant Commander Hershel Smith, the quiet engineer whose damage control training had saved her time and again. Smith moved through the dry dock like a surgeon inspecting an old patient. He signed off on every repair, rejected shortcuts, insisted that the lessons learned in flame and smoke be built into her bones. By May 1943, Enterprise was once again ready for sea, sleeker, stronger, and armed with new aircraft. Her hangars now carried the F-6F Hellcat, the SB-2C Helldiver, and the TBF Avenger machines faster and tougher than the planes that had fought Midway. With her air group rebuilt and her crew hardened by fire, Enterprise re-entered the war. The Gilbert Islands. First step west. In November 1943, the Pacific Offensive began. American forces targeted the Gilbert Islands, small atolls guarding Japan's outer ring of defense. The assault on Tarawa would test every element of the Navy's new strategy: amphibious invasion supported by relentless carrier strikes. Enterprise, now operating with the newly commissioned Essex-class carriers, formed the spearhead of Task Force 50 under Admiral Mark Mitcher. On November 19, her planes took to the air before dawn. Bombers streaked west toward Betio Island, fighters strafed coastal guns, torpedo planes searched for enemy ships. For 3 days the attacks never ceased. Enterprise pilots flew over 400 sorties, smashing airfields, fuel dumps, and defensive positions. The battle for Tarawa was brutal. Marines wading ashore under machine gun fire, but without carrier air cover, they would have been annihilated. When the last Japanese resistance ended, Enterprise's decks were coated in oil and soot from constant flight operations. Her crew had been on combat stations for 72 hours. She had lost aircraft and men, but she had helped crack open the first gate of Japan's Pacific Empire. The experience hardened her still more. Gone was the desperate defense of 1942. This was offense. The Grey Ghost had turned hunter. Marshall Islands and Truk. Breaking the ring. The next step was the Marshall Islands. Then the fortress at Truk Lagoon, Japan's equivalent of Pearl Harbor. In early 1944, Enterprise joined Task Force 58, the fast carrier strike force that would become the most powerful naval weapon in history. On January 29, 1944, she launched the first pre-invasion attacks on Kwajalein and Arran. Japanese airfields burned under bombs and rockets. Anti-aircraft bursts speckled the sky, but American pilots had become masters of coordination. Enterprise's fighters roamed overhead, cutting down interceptors before they could even climb. A month later came Operation Hailstone, the assault on Truk. For decades, the lagoon had been the pride of the Imperial Navy, filled with warships, tankers, and aircraft. Enterprise's planes arrived before dawn on February 17. Within hours, the sky was black with smoke. Dauntless and Helldiver bombers sank cruisers and destroyers. Avengers dropped torpedoes into anchored transports. Fighters strafed anything that moved. Japanese ships tried to flee through the channels but were caught and destroyed. By the time the raid ended, more than 40 ships and 200 aircraft had been sunk or destroyed. Truk was finished as a naval base. Sailors on Enterprise watched the fires glowing on the horizon that night and realized what they were witnessing. The death of Japan's Central Fleet anchorage. It was revenge for every blow since Pearl Harbor. Marianas and the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot with Truk neutralized. The American advance accelerated. In June 1944, Enterprise joined the assault on the Marianas Sipantinian and Guam, whose capture would bring Japan within range of B-29 bombers. The Japanese Navy threw everything it had left into the fight. The resulting engagement, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, became one of the most lopsided victories in naval history. On June 19th, Enterprise pilots sat ready on deck as radar screens bloomed with incoming contacts, hundreds of Japanese planes sweeping in from 250 miles west. The call went out. All fighters launched. Hellcats roared into the air, climbing into sunlight. The ensuing aerial slaughter became legend. American gunnery and fighter coordination were perfect. Japanese pilots, rushed through training, were not. By the end of the day, more than 350 enemy aircraft had been destroyed for the loss of barely 30 Americans. Pilots began calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Enterprise's air group alone shot down 52 aircraft and destroyed 3 enemy ships, more than any other carrier in the fleet. Her decks overflowed with returning planes. Some landed with bullet holes, some with landing gear shot away. Yet all came home. That evening, sailors gathered on the hangar deck, listening to the thunder of distant explosions as American dive bombers pursued the fleeing Japanese. The Pacific skies that had once belonged to Japan were now American. The Grey Ghost among giants. By late 1944, the fleet had changed. New Essex-class and Independence-class carriers filled the horizon, sleek, modern, fast, yet among them, Enterprise remained special. She had survived from the dark days when there was only one. Younger sailors saluted her in the distance as she passed, whispering, "That's the Ghost." Her crew felt the weight of legend. Some of her earliest veterans had rotated home, replaced by fresh recruits who had grown up hearing stories of her miracles. They stepped aboard with awe. Smith, now promoted to full commander, still ran the damage control division with the same obsessive precision. His men knew every hose connection, every pump and valve. The carrier's beating heart never missed a rhythm. Enterprise led Task Group 58.3 in the September strikes on the Palau Islands, softening them for invasion. Then she turned west, toward the Philippines, where history waited. October 1944, the largest battle of all, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, was the climax of carrier warfare, the largest naval engagement ever fought. Over 4 days, nearly 300 ships clashed in 4 connected actions across the Philippine archipelago. Enterprise's aircraft flew missions almost continuously, striking Japanese cruisers, destroyers, and transports as General MacArthur's forces landed on Leyte Island. When Japanese forces attempted to strike the invasion fleet from multiple directions, Enterprise's flyers were everywhere, attacking Admiral Kurita's center force in the Sibuyan Sea, crippling the super battleship Musashi, then rushing north to confront Admiral Ozawa's decoy carriers off Cape Engago. Enterprise's bombers and torpedo planes contributed to the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers, Zuiho Kitos and Chiyoda, the last remnants of the fleet that had once dominated the Pacific. Through it all, she absorbed punishment without faltering. 2 kamikaze planes struck her during the battle, smashing into her flight deck, killing men but failing to cripple operations. Fires flared were contained, and within minutes planes were launching again. For the crew, it was déjà vu, another day, another miracle of survival. When the battle ended on October 26, 1944, exactly 2 years to the day after Santa Cruz, the Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Enterprise had fought at both ends of the Pacific War and was still standing. The Night War begins. The next phase of Enterprise's story was innovation. The Navy faced a new threat: nighttime attacks by Japanese bombers and suicide planes. To counter them, Enterprise was selected to pioneer night carrier operations. In late 1944, she was refitted with radar-controlled landing systems, floodlights, and new instruments. Her air group, Night Air Group 90, trained to fly and fight in darkness, something no Navy had ever perfected. Her Hellcat fighters hunted Japanese intruders under moonlight. Her Avengers bombed enemy airfields while the rest of the fleet slept. The experiment worked. Enterprise became the world's first operational night carrier, and soon the Navy followed her lead, establishing entire night carrier task groups. Once again, the Ghost had rewritten the rules. Iwo Jima, the longest Dain, February 1945. Enterprise turned her prow toward Iwo Jima. The volcanic island was barely 8 square miles, but it was the doorstep to Japan. Enterprise's planes supported the Marines landing there, striking coastal defenses and flying close air support in endless relays. 4174. Continuous hours, more than 7 days. Enterprise kept aircraft in the air. It was the longest unbroken period of flight operations in history. Mechanics slept beside the planes they serviced. Pilots catnapped in the ready room between missions. The ship's catapults fired until their hydraulic pistons ran hot. By the end of the campaign, Enterprise's flight deck was blackened from exhaust and powder burns, but the island was in American hands. The flag raised on Mount Suribachi owed part of its ascent to the gray carrier steaming miles offshore. Striking the home islands, March 1945 brought a new stage. Raids on Japan itself. Enterprise aircraft bombed Tokyo, Kobe, and Nagoya, hitting factories, docks, and airfields. For many aboard, it was personal payback for Pearl Harbor. Japanese resistance was fierce. Kamikaze attacks multiplied daily. On March 18, a bomb hit near Enterprise's deck edge, wounding several men but failing to halt operations. The ship barely slowed. Sailors joked grimly that she was now allergic to rest, but the enemy was watching, waiting for an opening. Okinawa, the final crucible. In April 1945, the fleet gathered for the invasion of Okinawa, the bloodiest naval campaign of the Pacific. Hundreds of suicide planes descended daily on the invasion armada. Enterprise's fighters shot down many, but some always broke through. On April 11th, one kamikaze slammed into the carrier's forward flight deck. 14 men died, 34 were wounded. The blast wrecked the forward elevator, again the same cursed spot that had been hit at Santa Cruz 3 years earlier. Enterprise limped to Leyte Atoll for emergency repairs, and within a month she was back in action. Then, on May 14th, another kamikaze struck almost the same place. This one hit with devastating precision, exploding deep inside the ship. The blast tore a hole through multiple decks. Fires raced through hangars and compartments. 13 sailors died instantly. 68 were injured. Smoke poured from the forward section as damage control teams swarmed. Pumps thundered, hoses hissed, bulkheads were sealed. Commander Smith, older now but unrelenting, directed the effort with the same icy focus he had shown at Santa Cruz. Within hours, the fires were out. Enterprise still floated. The ship's log recorded the event with understatement. Enemy aircraft crashed on flight deck forward. Damage controlled. Ship proceeding on course. It was her 20th major battle and her last. The war's end. The May 14th strike forced Enterprise back to the United States for repairs that would last through the summer. While she lay in the dock at Bremerton, the war ended. Japan surrendered before she could return to combat. The Grey Ghost had survived from Pearl Harbor to victory, but she missed the peace ceremony in Tokyo Bay by a matter of weeks. Her final record was staggering. 911 enemy aircraft destroyed by her fighters and gunners. 1 enemy ships sunk. Nearly 200 more damaged or crippled. She had steamed more than 275,000 miles, fought in 18 of 22 major carrier actions, and earned 20 battle stars, 3 more than any other American ship. Her crew, 30,000 strong over 9 years of service, knew they had lived through something that would never happen again. They had watched the evolution of war from bombs and torpedoes to radar and night strikes and had outlasted every enemy thrown their way. In September 1945, as new carriers gleamed in the shipyards, Enterprise lay quietly in the Puget Sound Navy Yard. Her decks were silent, except for the echo of footsteps. Sailors looked up at her island superstructure and wondered what would become of her. Some believed she would be preserved as a national monument. Others feared she would simply fade away. For now, she rested scarred, triumphant, alive. The world had changed, but the ghost still floated, waiting for history's next chapter. The silent dockwind, the guns fell silent in August 1945. The USS Enterprise lay moored in a repair dock at Bremerton, Washington. The workmen there called her Old CV6, speaking the number with quiet awe. She had been hit by bombs, torpedoes, and kamikazes, yet she still floated. The weld seams that had once been scars of desperation now shone under new paint. Her engines, finally stilled, gave off the faint smell of oil and heat. Sailors walking her decks for the last time said the ship seemed restless, as if she couldn't quite believe the war was over. For nearly 4 years, she had known only motion launching, recovering, fighting, burning, surviving. Now there was only stillness. At the Navy Yard, she became a monument by accident. Visitors, workers, civilians, and young sailors from new ships walked her decks to feel the aura of the legend. They touched the patch plates along her flight deck, knowing that behind those seams lay the ghosts of men who had welded under fire at Guadalcanal, or fought fires at Santa Cruz, or held hoses at Okinawa while their ship burned around them. The Grey Ghost, undefeated in battle, had survived long enough to see peace. Tally of triumph in the months after surrender. The Navy compiled the final scorecard of Enterprise's career. It read like something out of myth. 911 enemy aircraft destroyed by her pilots and gunners. 71 enemy ships sunk. 192 damaged or crippled. 18 of 22 major carrier battles in the Pacific fought under her banner. 20 battle stars, more than any ship in the history of the United States Navy. She had steamed over 275,000 miles in wartime operations, launched tens of thousands of sorties, and survived hits that should have killed her 20 times over. She was the only carrier to receive both the Presidential Unit Citation and the Navy Unit Commendation. When the final report was signed, a note in the margin read simply, "No ship contributed more to victory, recognition, and forgetting for a moment." It seemed the Grey Ghost would become a national shrine. In 1946, naval historians and veterans groups petitioned Congress to preserve her as a museum. Newspapers wrote editorials calling for her to be anchored in New York Harbor beside the Statue of Liberty as a memorial to the Navy's sacrifice. Plans were drawn. Architects envisioned visitors walking her decks, seeing aircraft poised as if ready to launch again. Fundraisers promised that Americans would give whatever was needed, but peace had its own tides. The public, weary of war, turned to rebuilding homes, families, and futures. Attention drifted from the Pacific. Budgets tightened. New carriers, faster, larger, nuclear-powered, were already being designed. The Navy, eager to modernize, had little interest in keeping a relic. By 1947, Enterprise was decommissioned. Her colors struck. She sat at the pier, paint fading, rust streaking down her bow. The nameplate still gleamed, but fewer and fewer remembered why it mattered. The forgotten heroes, her crew, scattered across America. Some stayed in the Navy, climbing the ranks of a new peacetime fleet. Most returned quietly to civilian life. Pilots became airline captains. Gunners went back to factories and farms. Mechanics worked at auto shops. They carried with them memories they rarely spoke aloud. Captain Osborne Hardison, who had commanded the Enterprise through her darkest days in 1942, rose to the rank of Vice Admiral before retiring. In February 1959, he died from injuries in a car accident and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery beneath a headstone that bore only his name, rank, and dates. The stone did not mention the ship he had once saved. Commander Hershel Smith, the damage control officer whose skill had kept Enterprise alive, retired as a captain. There were no medals for what he had done, only terse mentions in after-action reports. Fire controlled by DC Division under LTCMDR. Smith, official. Histories credited the ship's survival to design improvements and crew efficiency. Smith's name disappeared between lines of bureaucratic understatement, yet every sailor who had served with him knew the truth. Without his knowledge, his calm under pressure, and the relentless training he had imposed, the carrier would have been lost more than once. After retirement, Smith moved inland, far from the sea. He never sought fame. He never gave interviews. But when veterans gathered at reunions, they toasted him quietly. Here's to the man who made steel breathe. The Seabees who had welded the flight deck at Noumea went back to construction jobs, building houses, bridges, and schools. Most never mentioned the 4 days in 1942 when they had saved the only American carrier left in the Pacific. They were craftsmen, not storytellers. But among them circulated a saying, "We built Enterprise once." That was enough for a lifetime. Wade McClusky, the pilot whose instinct at Midway had led the bombers to the enemy fleet, retired as a rear admiral. When he died in 1976, only a few historians remembered that one decision. Following a lone destroyer across an empty sea had changed the war. Thousands of others simply faded into anonymity. Names typed on rosters, filed in archives. 30,000 men served aboard Enterprise during her 9 years of active life. Most died without ever being asked what it had felt like to serve on a ship that refused to die. The accountant's death in 1948, the Navy placed the Grey Ghost in mothball status, anchoring her among rows of surplus ships. Seagulls nested in her island. Her flight deck grew streaked with rust and bird droppings. From the air, she looked like a sleeping giant surrounded by a graveyard of smaller vessels. Veterans groups kept pushing to save her. They formed committees, held meetings, wrote letters, but the cost estimates kept rising. $5 million to restore her, then 10, then more. The government offered no funds. Appeals to corporations failed. By 1956, the campaign had run out of money. In 1958, a single line in the Navy's surplus notice sealed her fate. Enterprise CV-6, for disposal. The winning bid came from the Lipset Corporation, a scrap dealer from New Jersey. The price, $561,333. The Navy accepted without ceremony. The world's most decorated warship, more honored than Missouri, more battle-tested than Iowa, more storied than any carrier afloat, was sold for less than the cost of one modern jet fighter. When the work began, veterans sent letters begging for delay. None came. By March 1960, she was gone, cut apart at Kearney, New Jersey. Her steel was melted down and vanished into the anonymous metal of post-war America. The Grey Ghost had finally died, not by enemy fire, but by apathy and arithmetic. What remained, only fragments, survived. Her bell went to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, where midshipmen still strike it on ceremonial days. Her stern plate was mounted in Rivervale, New Jersey. One anchor rests in the courtyard of the Washington Navy Yard. A few portholes, plaques, and fittings were rescued by veterans. The rest became scrap in memory. Yet even as her hull disappeared, her story refused to fade. Writers and historians who studied the Pacific War kept stumbling on her name in reports and communiques 105-6, again and again, at every turning point. Slowly, a realization grew. The ship that had been forgotten was the one that had carried the burden of the entire Pacific campaign. The lesson of lost destruction of Enterprise shocked a generation of naval veterans into action. If she could be lost, so could every other historic ship. By the late 1950s, preservation efforts for other vessels gained urgency. Civic leaders and veterans organizations began to rally. They pointed to the scrapping of Enterprise as a national shammer mistake. That must never happen again in the following decades. The change was dramatic. USS Intrepid CV-11 became a floating museum in New York. City.USS Hornet, CV-12, namesake of the ship lost at Santa Cruz, was saved in Alameda. California USS Lexington CV-16 found a home in Corpus Christi. Texas.USS Yorktown CV-10 anchored in Charleston. South Carolina.USS Midway CV-41 became a museum in San Diego. Visitors walking their decks today are, in a sense, walking through Enterprise's shadow. Her loss taught America that history left unguarded would vanish. The ships that survived do so because she did not. Echoes of the name the Navy itself refused to let the name die. In 1961, a new Enterprise took to the CCVN-65, the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. She was the most advanced warship of her era, 8 reactors humming deep within her hull, a symbol of technological might. Sailors called her the Big E, honoring her predecessor. For more than half a century, she patrolled every ocean through the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, the Cold War, the Persian Gulf, and beyond. She served 51 years, longer than any carrier before or since. When she was decommissioned in 2017, her captain read a message from history, from the decks of the Grey Ghost to the dawn of the nuclear age. The name Enterprise has never known defeat, and soon another would rise. The next in line, CVN-80, a Ford-class super, is under construction scheduled to sail in the late 2020s. Her keel was laid with a piece of steel, reclaimed from CVN-65, carrying the lineage forward. On the day she is commissioned, the Navy will once again speak a name that has spanned a century of American power. Enterprise, the Ghost's true legacy, the first Enterprise, the one forged in 1938 and baptized in fire from 1941 to 1945, exists now only in photographs and memories, in the stories passed down by those who served. Yet her legacy is more than steel. It lives in the doctrine she inspired. Before her, damage control was a checklist. After her, it was an art. Every ship that followed trained its men to the standard Hershel Smith set drills, precision, calm under pressure. Before her, carrier warfare was theory. After her, it was dominance. Before her, morale was fragile. After her, it became belief that a ship and crew, united, could survive anything. Enterprise taught the Navy that victory depended not on perfection, but on resilience. She proved that a vessel could be broken, patched, burned, and still fight harder than any pristine machine. She showed that fighting spirit was not a slogan. It was men welding at midnight under air raids, pilots flying borrowed planes, officers making impossible calls because no one else would. She taught that sometimes the greatest weapon is not armor or guns, but the refusal to quit. The memory reawakened in 1991, nearly half a century after her scrapping. A naval historian digging through national archives in Maryland uncovered the long-lost war damage and action reports of the Enterprise. Buried in those papers were details forgotten since the 1940s. Hershel Smith's emergency repair orders, CB engineering notes from the day-by-day battle logs of November 1942. The historian tracked down surviving crewmen, men now in their 70s and 80s. Some could barely hear, others could no longer walk. But when asked about those days, their eyes lit up. They remembered the smell of aviation fuel, the metallic taste of smoke in their mouths, the roar of engines, and the hammer of anti-aircraft guns. They remembered the moment when the deck shuddered under impact, and they thought it was over, and then Smith's voice shouting orders in the dark. They remembered the welders on the deck at Noumea, sparks flying into the night, and the strange comfort of hearing hammers still pounding as the ship sailed toward battle. They remembered the feeling of being invincible because they sailed on the Enterprise. Why the Ghost still matters today. When visitors stand on the decks of the museum carriers that followed her, most don't realize that they are walking through echoes of her design, her survival, her spirit. Every damaged control station, every training manual, every safety drill bears traces of the lessons she wrote in blood and steel. She is gone, but the belief she embodied that ordinary men can do impossible things when the world depends on it remains the truest monument of all. For the veterans who lived it, the memory of those nights at Guadalcanal never faded. In quiet moments they could still hear the pounding of hammers and the whine of welders as the ship rolled through dark seas, still under repair, still going forward. They could still hear Smith's calm voice over the roar, "Keep her alive, just keep her alive." And they did. For 4 years, against every odd, they kept her alive. Because of them, a war turned. Because of them, the world changed. The Grey Ghost lives on. The first Enterprise was not the biggest ship, nor the fastest, nor the most modern. She was something rarer, indestructible in spirit. When the Japanese called her the Grey Ghost, they meant it as an insult, a phantom they could never sink. But history made it a compliment. She was the ghost that haunted them from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, the apparition that refused to die until the job was done. Today, her steel lies scattered, but her name endures in every ocean she once ruled. The sailors who walk the decks of CVN-80 will inherit more than a tradition. They will inherit a promise, forged in smoke and courage 8 decades ago. We will not die while the mission remains. And somewhere, deep beneath the Pacific waters where her planes once flew, the spirit of the old carrier still lingers, riding the currents. Proud, silent, undefeated, the Grey Ghost sails forever.